Everything you heard about dying rich was a lie. We have this collective fantasy about extreme wealth. We believe that if we hit the ultimate financial finish line, our final years will be a seamless glide into paradise. We picture the billionaire playboy spending down a bottomless fortune, buying islands, and leaving this world with a satisfied smile. Nobody mentions this, but nobody talks about what happens after you achieve that ultimate goal. What happens to the human mind when it accumulates more capital than it could possibly consume in 1,000 lifetimes? Most people assume the ultra-wealthy simply spend down their money as they approach death, but behavioral economics proves the exact opposite. Today, we are tearing down the facade. We are looking beyond the hustle culture myths to examine the dark pathology of wealth hoarding, the desperate attempts at posthumous control, and the statistical realities that contradict everything we assume about the ultra-rich. To understand the psychology of dying rich, we first have to look at the math of living rich. The traditional model of retirement tells us we spend our lives accumulating so that in our final decades we can draw down those resources. But for the ultra-wealthy, that downward arch never happens. Let's look at the Employee Benefit Research Institute, or EBRI. In a recent comprehensive study frequently cited in wealth management, they uncovered a massive data anomaly. They found that 1 in 3 wealthy retirees actually reached their mid-80s with more money than they had the day they retired. And this isn't just because their investments are performing well. It is a psychological defect. They become psychologically trapped in what behavioral economists call accumulation mode. For decades, their brain has been wired to equate saving and earning with safety and success. By the time they have enough money to finally rest, the neurological pathways are completely calcified. They literally lose the cognitive ability to spend money on themselves. This cognitive trap brings us to one of the most famous conundrums in behavioral economics, the annuity puzzle. First noted by economist Menahem Yari in 1965, the puzzle asks a very simple question. Why do wealthy people refuse to buy annuities? Mathematically, a wealthy person could hand over a chunk of their fortune in exchange for a guaranteed, lavish income stream for the exact duration of their life. It removes all risk of outliving their money. Yet they almost universally reject it. And the psychological answer isn't that they want to leave a massive inheritance to their children. Research shows their refusal is driven by a profound, paralyzing phobia of late-in-life medical care risk. Despite having millions, they are terrified of an imaginary, catastrophic medical bill. Worse, they suffer from an irrational fear of losing liquid control of their capital. They would rather die sitting on a towering pile of unused, stagnant cash than relinquish control to an institution. And the cruelest part of this psychological trap? The finish line doesn't actually exist. Wealth researchers at institutions like the Boston College Center on Wealth and Philanthropy have conducted intense psychometric testing on the ultra-rich. They wanted to understand the baseline emotional state of individuals with a net worth over $25 million. When these individuals were surveyed, their number one reported end-of-life anxiety wasn't family, legacy, or health. It was financial security. Let that sink in. People with more than $25 million in the bank are lying awake at night, terrified of going broke. The researchers asked them a simple question. How much more money do you need to feel secure enough to die in peace? The average answer was universally the same, about 25% more. It did not matter if the individual had 25 million or 250 million. The brain constantly adjusts the goalpost. They are trapped on a hedonistic treadmill of capital preservation, chasing a feeling of safety that money is completely incapable of providing. When the ultra-wealthy finally reach the end and the illusion shatters, when they realize they truly cannot take their fortune into the afterlife, a darker pathology often takes hold. If they cannot spend it, they will use it to psychologically torment, manipulate, and control the living from beyond the grave. Meet Wellington R. Burt. By 1919, this Saginaw lumber tycoon had amassed an empire, dying with an estate estimated at $100 million. But Burt was a bitter, isolated man who harbored deep resentments against his own family. To punish his children for perceived slights, Bert's will contained a venomous spite clause. He legally stipulated that his vast fortune could not be distributed to his heirs until exactly 21 years after the death of his last surviving grandchild who was alive at the time of his own death. He weaponized a legal doctrine known as the rule against perpetuities to effectively starve his own children and grandchildren of their inheritance. The estate sat locked in a legal vault for 92 years. Generation after generation of Bert's family lived and died without seeing a dime of the lumber baron's money. Finally, in May 2011, the clause expired. The massive estate was dispersed to 12 distant descendants. Some received $16 million, others $2.6 million. Not a single one of them had ever met the man who made them rich. His ultimate legacy was almost a century of manufactured familial anxiety. But if Wellington Bert's will was about spite, Toronto lawyer Charles Vance Millar's will was a grotesque social experiment. Millar, who died in 1926, was a known practical joker who viewed humanity with deep cynicism. In Clause 9 of his will, Millar dictated that his remaining fortune, roughly $9 million in today's money, would not go to friends or family. Instead, it was to be given to the Toronto woman who gave birth to the highest number of children in the 10 years following his death. This wasn't just a joke. It was psychological manipulation on a mass scale. Because shortly after he died, the Great Depression struck. Desperate, starving families saw Millar's fortune as a lottery ticket. This sparked a furious, decade-long baby-making race that the press dubbed the Great Stork Derby. Women were literally risking their lives, enduring back-to-back pregnancies in squalid conditions for a chance at the money. The chaos was so severe, it went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. In 1938, the court upheld the will, and the money was ultimately split between 4 women who tied with an astonishing 9 babies each. Millar proved his cynical point from the grave. Money could make desperate people do anything. This transactional view of humanity is a recurring sickness in dynastic wealth. Judge Thomas Mellon, the patriarch of the massive Mellon banking dynasty, died in 1908. But in 1885, he wrote a private autobiography where he laid out his chilling philosophy. He warned his family that parental affection was merely a transaction. He explicitly refused to give his children equal inheritances. To Mellon, his children were not family. They were business assets. He distributed his wealth strictly based on their perceived economic efficiency. Love was a balance sheet, and his offspring had to prove their ROI to receive his affection. And when they don't trust their children at all, they leave it to the one thing that can't talk back. Enter Leona Helmsley, the infamous Queen of Mean. When the real estate mogul died in 2007, she made headlines by intentionally disinheriting 2 of her own grandchildren, while leaving a staggering $12 million trust to her Maltese dog, Trouble. But what is rarely mentioned is the extraordinary legal intervention that followed. In 2008, Manhattan surrogate court judge Renee Roth reviewed the case and ruled that Helmsley was psychologically over-allocating. The hotel manager who cared for the dog proved that $2 million was more than enough to cover the animal's lifetime expenses. The judge legally slashed the dog's inheritance and redirected $10 million to human charities. Even in death, a judge had to step in to curb the pathology of a billionaire's spite. We admire frugality. Society praises the billionaire who drives an old Honda or wears a plain gray t-shirt. But there is a line where frugality mutates into extreme miserliness. And psychologists will tell you this is not humility. It is a psychological disorder, often linked to frontal lobe decay and profound trauma. Consider John Elwes. He is widely believed to be the true inspiration for Charles Dickens' character Ebenezer Scrooge. When Elwes died in 1789, he possessed a fortune equivalent to $80 million in today's money. Yet his daily existence was a living hell of his own making. He was so terrified of spending his vast wealth that he wore beggars' cast-off wigs he found discarded in hedges.
He ate putrefied meat that was rotting in his kitchen. He slept in wet clothes to save the fractional cost of lighting a fire. He even let the roof of his own mansion leak onto his guests rather than pay a roofer. But here is the psychological paradox of John Elwes. He exhibited a bizarre split between micro-stinginess and macro-generosity. While he starved himself over pennies, he would lend massive sums of money to friends and never ask for repayment. His brain could process abstract, large-scale financial loss, but completely short-circuited at the physical, daily act of spending a single coin on his own survival. Fast forward to the 20th century. Daniel Ludwig was a titan of industry, a shipping magnate who built a global empire. When he died in 1992, he was worth over $1.2 billion. Despite being a billionaire, Ludwig lived in a modest New York City apartment and walked to work every day. The press loved this. They called him grounded. But psychologists classify this behavior under a much darker label: pauper's phobia. Pauper's phobia is a paralyzing, often childhood-induced trauma that leaves billionaires terrified they will end up completely broke. Ludwig's brain was utterly incapable of processing that he was safe. His daily walk to work wasn't an exercise in humility. It was an act of survival, driven by the irrational fear that if he spent money on a taxi, it would be the first domino leading him to be buried in an unmarked pauper's grave.
But we also have to be careful, because sometimes the psychology of the rich is perfectly rational, and it's the public that projects pathology onto them. Take the ultimate pop culture myth of billionaire cheapness, J. Paul Getty's payphone. The story goes that Getty was such a miserable miser that he installed a coin-operated payphone in his mansion, forcing his wealthy guests to pay for their calls. It's a great story. It's also completely taken out of context. In his autobiography, Getty explained the actual truth. He only installed the payphone for 18 months during a massive renovation of his Sutton Place estate. Contractors, artisans, and tradesmen were sneaking onto his undial-locked house phones and making wildly expensive overseas calls to relatives in Geneva and Caracas. The payphone was a practical wealth defense mechanism against employee theft, which the media eagerly twisted into miserly psychology. The media's desire to demonize the wealthy, especially wealthy women, is perfectly encapsulated in the tragic myth of Hetty Green. When she died in 1916, Hetty Green was the richest woman in America, worth roughly $2.5 billion today. She was ruthless, brilliant, and deeply frugal. But the most famous story about her is a horrifying lie. The myth states that Hetty was so incredibly cheap, she refused to pay a doctor for her son Ned's injured leg, resulting in its amputation. The truth? She did pay for private doctors. Ned suffered a severe sledding accident, but the leg simply didn't heal properly. Gangrene set in years later, forcing the amputation to save his life. But a deeply sexist Gilded Age press couldn't accept a female financial genius, so they weaponized a mother's tragedy to paint her as a wicked, miserly witch. Perhaps the deepest psychological burden of extreme wealth is the realization, too late in life, that the money itself is a trap, that you cannot outrun the mathematical gravity of your own fortune. No one understood this better than Andrew Carnegie. In 1889, he published The Gospel of Wealth, famously declaring that the man who dies thus rich dies disgraced. He believed inherited wealth was poison and vowed to give it all back to society. Carnegie spent the last 2 decades of his life in a desperate, frantic race to give away his entire $380 million fortune. He built thousands of libraries, funded universities, and created endowments. But there was a massive mathematical problem. His immense wealth was generating compound interest faster than he could effectively vet and fund charities. He was literally making money faster than a human being could responsibly give it away. In the end, he failed his own mandate. When Carnegie died in 1919, he died disgraced by his own definition, with $30 million still trapped in his estate. Other titans fail not because they can't give it away, but because they suffer from a fatal psychological blind spot regarding the nature of wealth itself. They conflate net worth with liquidity. Take Samuel Brannan, California's very first millionaire. He didn't make his fortune digging for gold. He made it selling shovels to the prospectors during the 1849 gold rush. He built a massive empire of real estate and businesses.
Yet when he died in 1889, he was completely penniless. He couldn't even pay for his own funeral. What happened? The illiquid death paradox. In 1870, Brannon went through a bitter divorce. His wife demanded her half of his vast empire, and she demanded it in cash. Because Brannon's massive net worth was entirely tied up in illiquid hard assets, land and buildings, he couldn't simply write a check.
He was forced into a devastating fire sale, liquidating his real estate for pennies on the dollar, just to generate the cash for the settlement. The divorce didn't just split his wealth. The friction of liquidating it completely wiped him out. He died a beggar because he didn't understand that being rich on paper means absolutely nothing if you can't access the cash. If extreme wealth is a trap of compound interest, spite, and illiquidity, is it possible to escape it? Yes, but you have to do it in secret. Chuck Feeney, the billionaire co-founder of duty-free shoppers, is famously celebrated for achieving what Carnegie couldn't, giving away his entire $8 billion fortune before he died. But what people miss is how he had to do it. To escape the psychological and systemic trap of his own wealth, he had to operate like a covert agent. In 1982, Feeney secretly and irrevocably transferred his entire 38.75% corporate stake to a holding company in Bermuda, known as the Atlantic Philanthropies. He did this specifically to hide it from Wall Street, the Forbes 400 list, and most importantly, his own fierce business partner, Robert Miller, who violently opposed Feeney's desire to give the company's profits away. Feeney realized the only way to avoid dying rich was to secretly sever his legal ownership decades before his death. But ultimately, the greatest psychological delusion regarding dying rich doesn't belong to the billionaires. It belongs to us, the public. We are obsessed with the fantasy of the billionaire benefactor. When the deeply paranoid, germaphobe billionaire Howard Hughes died in 1976, a bizarre mystery unfolded. A handwritten will suddenly appeared at the headquarters of the Mormon Church. The will claimed to leave 1/16 of Hughes' massive $2 billion estate, roughly $150 million, to a completely random rural gas station owner named Melvin Dumar. Dumar's story was incredible. He claimed that back in 1967, he found a disheveled Hughes wandering the freezing Nevada desert and kindly gave him a ride back to Vegas. The public went wild for this story. The psychological fascination was intoxicating. We desperately wanted to believe that a dying, paranoid billionaire would experience a moment of profound clarity and leave a massive fortune to a random good Samaritan who showed him kindness. We wanted the fairy tale. But in 1978, reality crashed down. A Las Vegas jury definitively rejected the will as an elaborate forgery. The fairy tale was a lie. We look at extreme wealth as the ultimate liberation, but the data, the history, and the psychology tell a very different story. For many, accumulating vast capital doesn't buy freedom. It buys a hyperfixation on preservation. It buys the delusion that 25% more will finally bring peace. It breeds a paranoia that turns children into balance sheets and transforms the end of a human life into a mechanism for spite. Everything you heard about dying rich was a lie. The money does not solve the human condition. In the end, it merely acts as a magnifying glass for the darkest, most broken parts of our psychology. And for the titans of industry who cross that final finish line, the greatest tragedy isn't that they can't take their gold with them. It's that the gold took them a long time ago.